Thank you very much. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Andrew Porwancher. I am a professor of constitutional history here at SCETL, and I am also the director of graduate studies. And I'm really honored to moderate a panel with three really eminent historians of this time period, beginning with Elijah Gould, who's a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. He's written extensively on the American Revolution and emphasizes the entangled history that Americans share with the rest of the Americas and the wider world. His books include The Persistence of Empire, British Political Culture in the Age of American Revolution, which won the prestigious Jamestown Prize from the Omohundro Institute. He authored Empire and Nation, The American Revolution in the Atlantic World. He co-edited with Professor Peter Onuf, who's here with us, Among the Powers of the Earth, The American Revolution, and the Making of the New World Empire, which won the Scheer Book Prize and was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. He has held long-term fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, twice with the National Endowment for the Humanities, the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, the Charles Warren Center at Harvard, the Fulbright Hays program at the UK. He's going to be going back to the UK to be the Harmsworth Professor of American History for the next academic year at Oxford University. To his right, from my perspective, to his left, for you, is Jane Calvert, the director and chief editor of the Writings of John Dickenson Project. She received her PhD in history from the University of Chicago, and her research interests are in the intersection of theology and politics of the American founding, with a focus on John Dickinson. She's taught at a number of institutions over the last 20 years, and she directs the John Dickinson Writings Project full-time. Her most recent book, which came out last year with Oxford University Press, was Penman of the Founding, a biography of John Dickinson. And finally, our last speaker here, forgive me, is Craig Yirush, who is a professor of history at the University of California at Los Angeles at UCLA. He was educated at the University of British Columbia, Cambridge, and Johns Hopkins, and he teaches and writes about the intellectual history of the 17th and 18th century British world. He is the author of Settlers, Liberty, and Empire, The Roots of American Political Theory, 1675 to 1775. Please join me in welcoming the esteemed panel, and we are going to kick things off first with Professor Gould.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And let me just second the thanks we've heard so far to Will for organizing this wonderful conference, and to Janelle for just handling everything. It's really been quite amazing. And thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see such a crowd. One other note, that I changed one word in my title from expansive to imperial. We're hearing a lot about imperial. I didn't want to be left out. So, okay. On April 19th, 1775, the day that the shot heard round the world was fired at Concord's North Bridge, Benjamin Franklin was on a ship from England. By the time he made landfall, the road to Lexington and Concord had already been traversed, and the war was more than 2 weeks old. Yet much about the conflict remained unclear. Among the more urgent questions was exactly what form to give the United Colonies, as Congress had begun calling the Colonial Association, a raid against the King's forces. That was the breach that Dr. Franklin set out to fill with the plan of confederation that he proposed to Congress on July 21st. In deference to moderates who had yet to abandon hope for reconciliation, one of the most influential being fellow Pennsylvanian John Dickinson, Franklin agreed to leave his plan on the table and off the record. But the printed version circulated widely and is generally credited with starting the process that culminated in the Declaration of Independence and in the Articles of Confederation that Congress adopted in 1777. By then, Franklin was back in Europe, this time as the United States would-be minister to France, but he deserves as much credit as anyone for the Union's first federal charter. Well, in my talk today, I want to situate Franklin's plan within a long-running debate over the proper structure of Britain's American empire, a debate that had become acute over the previous decade, but that had much deeper roots at least as deep as the Tudor Empire of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. For Franklin, who had spent most of his adult life serving the British Empire, empire was a term that denoted several overlapping forms. Three in particular would have been familiar to him and to his contemporaries in Britain and America. The first was empire as an independent power subject to no other power. The second was empire as a federation of self-governing powers. And the third was empire as the dominion of one power over another. Although the confederation that he proposed during the summer of 1775 suggests a preference for the second form, Franklin cared deeply about empire's independence. And he knew that federal empires often had difficulty maintaining their independence in the face of threats from other empires. And for the truth of that, Franklin, like people in both Britain and America, only needed to look at what had happened to Poland in 1774. The first partition of Poland was a federation, an empire with Lithuania, and included much of what is today Western Ukraine. So he was aware of that. Franklin also believed that whatever form the American empire ultimately took would likely involve the exercise of some sort of dominion over the indigenous nations in the Union's neighborhood. For both reasons, Franklin believed that if Americans were to succeed in their struggle for liberty, they would need to create their own version of Britain's American empire. As far as Franklin was concerned, liberty and empire, which are and were often depicted as opposites, were two parts of the same whole. Okay, well, the first meaning of empire was an independent, self-governing power, one whose rulers possessed what Franklin's fellow congressman, David Ramsey of South Carolina, in an oration on the second anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, described as, quote, an independent station among the empires of the world. Empire, in this sense, had deep roots in British history. In terms of Britain's relations with its colonies, the most important statement occurred in Parliament's 1533 Act in Restraint of Appeals. And it's important to note here, Franklin has quite a lot to say about this Tudor Empire. He draws a lot of comparisons between the empire of Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth and the modern British Empire. So, enacted as part of Henry VIII's ecclesiastical break with Rome, the statute declared that, quote, this realm of England is an empire, a realm, that is, whose monarch, by virtue of his imperial crown, was subject to no other spiritual or temporal power. Although Pope Clement VII, the ruler whose authority Parliament nullified, was the ostensible target, the statute strengthened Henry's domestic authority as well by proclaiming him to be England's one supreme head and king, with all the powers that had formerly belonged to the Roman Catholic Church. To secure that English empire from Catholic neighbors, Henry and his successors also strengthened their grip on England's neighbors by absorbing Wales, by turning the lordship of Ireland into a dependent kingdom, and during the reign of Henry's daughter Elizabeth I, by making the first attempts to plant colonies in America. For the same reason that the Tudors acknowledged no external limits on their power in Europe, there were no limits, apart from limits that they themselves were willing to observe, on their power within their own dominions. Well, by 1775, George III's crown was no longer English but British, and the king governed the empire conjointly with Parliament, as we heard this morning, which since the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707 was also British. No less important, the British Empire was a global polity with colonies and overseas dependencies in Europe, India, Africa, and of course North America and the Caribbean. To a remarkable degree, however, the logic that informed England's Tudor Empire remained alive and well. For Franklin and his contemporaries, the clearest, most important British expression of empire as a sovereign and independent power was the Navigation Act. first enacted in 1651 by the Parliament of Oliver Cromwell and renewed following the restoration of Charles II, and again after the accession of William and Mary. The act required colonies to export their most valuable commodities in English ships via English ports. As became clear during the 1760s and early 1770s, the law was an early and disturbing sign of Parliament's claim to the same imperial authority as the Crown, another thing we heard about this morning. Its main purpose, however, was to boost Britain's maritime power at the expense of its European rivals, especially the Dutch Republic and France. From a minor player in European politics, Britain became Europe's leading maritime power, with the largest navy and merchant marine in the world. Although Congress had changed its position by the time Franklin arrived in Philadelphia, the Navigation Act enjoyed a surprising degree of American support. To be sure, service in the Royal Navy was no more popular in colonial ports than it was in England, nor, to judge from the complaints of British customs officials, was obeying the laws against smuggling. Because the Navigation Act treated colonial ships and sailors as British, however, it spurred a shipbuilding industry in New England and the Middle Colonies that by the time of the first shots at Lexington and Concord accounted for a third of Britain's total merchant marine. During the protests over the Sugar and Stamp Acts in 1765, and again during the resistance to the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767, Americans insisted that they accepted Britain's regulation of their trade. In the words of the Stamp Act Congress that gathered in New York during the fall of 1765, Britain's trade monopoly enabled Americans, quote, to contribute very largely, if indirectly, to the revenue that the Crown collected in England, Scotland, and Wales. There was no need to tax them directly. Franklin made the same point in his testimony against the stamp tax in the House of Commons. As far as Americans were concerned, he said, "The sea is yours. You maintain by your fleets the safety of navigation in it, and keep it clear of pirates. You may therefore have a natural and equitable right to some toll or duty on merchandises carried through that part of your dominions." If Americans accepted and admired Britain's maritime empire, the intrusion of that empire into their internal affairs was another matter. In terms of its impact on the administration of the colonies, the American Stamp Act was every bit as revolutionary as Henry VIII's Act in Restraint of Appeals. Instead of extending the Crown's imperial jurisdiction over England and its nearest neighbors, Parliament targeted the King's colonies and plantations in America, but it partook of the same logic. Just as Parliament strengthened and standardized Henry's authority in England and Wales, the Stamp Act subjected, or attempted to subject, George III's subjects in America to the sovereignty that the Crown and Parliament together possessed in England and the rest of Britain. Ironically, two of Franklin's pamphlets, both published during the 7 Years' War, helped popularize the idea that Britain and the colonies were part of the same nation with the same rights and duties. In Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, published in 1755, and The Interests of Great Britain Considered from 1760, Franklin argued that the colonies had become such vital parts of the British Empire by sea as well as land that Britons and Americans now belong to the same political body. Thanks to Britain's maritime empire, he wrote, the banks of the Ohio are nearer to London than the remote parts of France and Spain are to their respective capitals, and much nearer than Connaught and Ulster were in the days of Queen Elizabeth. Again, you can see that Tudor comparison. By incorporating the colonies into an imperial nation that it claimed to virtually represent and had a right to tax, Parliament was embarking on a project that Franklin opposed, but the greater British nation upon which its fiscal claims depended was a conceit that he had helped call into being. Well, in its transoceanic vastness and diversity, the empire of George III was a far different polity from the archipelagic empire of the Tudors. As the implications of Parliament's reforms became clear, Americans, Franklin very much included, responded by advancing a second alternative theory of the British Empire as a union or federation of sovereign powers. And we've heard a lot about this already. A form better suited, they argued, to governing a global empire. And this connection between confederation and geographic extent is hugely important. I suspect Jack Green will have more to say about that tomorrow. As with the unitary theory of empire, empire as a federation of autonomous powers had a well-established place in the history of England's relations with its nearest neighbors. Rather than treating Ireland and Scotland as junior partners, however, empire as federation cast the relationship as a union between equals. And this is picked up. There's actually quite a lot of writing about this in the 17th century, and sometimes including Americans in that, other times not. But in the years before the Revolution, such ideas found a receptive audience in America, with Franklin playing an especially important role. During the Albany Congress of 1754, convened by colonial leaders on the eve of the 7 Years' War, Franklin helped draft a plan of union between the King's North American colonies and the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, something I don't think was mentioned this morning, but that indigenous dimension is really important. The Haudenosaunee were the dominant indigenous power from what is today upstate New York into the Ohio Valley. Although the proposal foundered amid British and colonial opposition who feared it was too centralizing, it formed the basis for Franklin's Confederation in 1775, which of course helped lay the groundwork for the Articles of Confederation. As Franklin's remarks in the House of Commons suggested, part of federalism's appeal was its convergence with how Britain's empire in America actually worked, with colonial assemblies acting as local parliaments within their respective provinces, while Parliament held sway over the surrounding seas. Speaking in 1774 of the requisition system, whereby assemblies augmented the king's regular forces in times of war with provincial ships and soldiers, Franklin claimed that there was no need for Parliament to tax the colonies directly. Not only did requisition enable Britain to raise, quote, all the money that could reasonably be expected, but they did so without violating the right of British Americans to be taxed by their own legislatures. Had this happy method been continued, Franklin said, there would have been no change to the harmony that so long subsisted between the two countries. And that note of regret, as we were reminded this morning, will continue really for the rest of Franklin's life. Increasingly, though, Empire's federation became a way to dispense with Parliament's imperial authority altogether, including the regulation of the colony's trade. In the words of Edward Bancroft, an American-born physician resident in London, England's title to North America was originally vested in Queen Elizabeth, again, that Tudor empire. Although the colonies owed allegiance to the crown, they are under no obligation to obey any acts of Parliament, including for the regulation of their trade. In his summary view of the rights of British America in 1774, Thomas Jefferson famously called on George III, quote, to resume the exercise of his negative power by checking Parliament's despotic pretensions, in a conspicuous break with the position that Franklin had taken in the House of Commons. He included the Navigation Acts as one of those pretensions. Out of deference to moderates in Congress, Franklin's draft confederation only called on Parliament to repeal the trade restrictions in the so-called coercive acts of 1774. But until Parliament complied, Congress would exercise the regulatory power over trade that it had exercised. Franklin also demanded the withdrawal of all British troops, which was the primary rationale for Parliament's taxation, as Rachel reminded us this morning. In practice, if not in law, Franklin envisioned the British Empire in America as a Commonwealth Union held together by common allegiance to the Crown, not the British Crown and Parliament. So has anyone mentioned the Carlisle Peace Commission? In one of the Revolution's more unexpected twists, Britain belatedly accepted this federal model of empire. In early 1778, as Franklin and his fellow commissioners were about to sign a treaty of alliance with France in Paris, the North Ministry dispatched the Earl of Carlisle and several other peace commissioners to Philadelphia. Before Carlisle sailed, Parliament enacted a new declaratory act that permanently revoked its right to tax the colonies for revenue. The government also authorized Carlisle to offer several more radical concessions, including the allowing the colonies to elect their own governors, recognizing Congress as an American parliament, and incorporating the Articles of Confederation into Britain's own imperial constitution, in effect creating a written imperial constitution. The only requirement was that Americans reaffirm to their allegiance to the crown. This, of course, went nowhere. It was unacceptable, but these offers helped pave the way for Ireland to win legislative independence in 1782, and they effectively, if implicitly, limited Parliament's authority over the remaining colonies in Canada and the West Indies. More than a century after the Revolutionary War, F.W. Maitland reminded his students at Cambridge that Parliament, quote, habitually refrained from making laws of a certain class because its members knew, quote, such laws would not be obeyed. The laws that Maitland had in mind were colonial revenue measures. In an irony that Franklin would surely have appreciated, the reason for restraint was the memory of the American Revolution. If the federalism that Franklin helped popularize placed limits on Britain's imperial authority, it did nothing to check the territorial ambitions of the colonies that became the United States. As signaled in a series of letters between 1774 and 1776 to the people of Quebec, one of Congress's aims both before and after independence was to absorb Canada, Nova Scotia, and the rest of British North America. In making the case for adding Canada to the Union, Congress appealed to a common liberty that it claimed Americans shared with the province's 90,000 French habitants. But all three letters warned Canadians that the alternative to joining their southern neighbors was war. You are a small people compared to those who with open arms invite you into a fellowship, wrote the authors of the first letter, which they asked was better, to have all of North America your unalterable friends or your inveterate enemies. And of course, during the fall of 1775, Continental soldiers under Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold, not yet a traitor, made good on that threat with a two-pronged invasion, and Franklin himself went to Canada the following spring, partly because he was one of the few members who spoke fluent French. In the Articles of Confederation, Congress named Canada as the one British province that could join without the state's prior approval. Canada also appeared in the Model Treaty, which John Adams drafted with Franklin to guide relations with France, and it remained an invasion target for the rest of the war. In the interest of time, I will limit what I have to say about Franklin's thought regarding the third and final form of empire, the government of one power or people over another. I think it's safe to say Franklin would not have accepted Congress's conquest theory, which was articulated in 1784 in a treaty with the Haudenosaunee, once again, the pivotal nation in these relations. Instead, he regarded Native Americans more as what John Marshall, in his landmark 1831 Supreme Court case, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, would describe as domestic dependent nations. One of the articles in his 1775 Confederation called for a permanent alliance with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, much like the one that he had proposed at Albany 20 years before. Okay, well, in conclusion, I want to stress 3 points. How am I doing for time? Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Okay. All right, well, real quick, Franklin's Plan of Confederation shows he's a firm believer in federalism as the best and only way to organize an extensive empire. He never, however, gives up on the unitary empire and the importance for independence. The question was, how do you reconcile these? And of course, the American Constitution, which he participated in writing in 1787, was the founders' attempt. The question is whether that problem has yet been resolved. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to echo what Lige said. I'd like to thank Will and Janelle for inviting us here and for all the wonderful hospitality we've experienced. It's wonderful to see so many old friends and to meet some new ones, and appreciate the audience coming and listening to this on what's a beautiful day outside. Very impressive commitment to history. I want to talk today about the final appeal in a long legal case over native rights between the Mohegan Indians and the colony of Connecticut. The final appeal was heard before the Privy Council in 1771. It was a case that a prominent 18th century lawyer called the greatest cause that was ever heard at the board, that is, before the council board. Now, at first glance, the Mohegan case might not seem to have much, if anything, to do with the colonists' experience of imperial reform. But if you will indulge me, I will argue that it does. In June of 1771, William Samuel Johnson was in London. I got to point at you, right? Good. I knew I'd get punished for using PowerPoint slides. This is never a good idea. So this is William Samuel Johnson. He was in London in 1771, and he wasn't happy about it. He'd arrived 4 long years before in 1767, and he was pining for a home. While in London, he had avidly followed the unfolding imperial crisis, assiduously attending parliamentary debates about America, meeting many of the principal actors, and even having a long discussion with Lord Hillsborough, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, about colonial rights. All of this he relayed to the governors of Connecticut in a series of letters that give us a wonderful glimpse into how one American experienced British reforms. But Johnson, a prominent lawyer and politician in Connecticut, was not in London because of parliamentary taxes or duties. Instead, he was there to assist the colony in its long legal fight with the Mohegan Indians, who were suing Connecticut over land they claimed was theirs, but which had been taken by the colony and incorporated into towns. The case had been going on since the early 1700s. Connecticut had lost the first round, refusing to appear before a royal commission held in the colony in 1705 on the grounds that their charter didn't allow the crown to set up a court in the colony, and that trying land titles in a court without juries violated the rights of English subjects. Connecticut also denied the right of anybody in the colony, native or English, to appeal to the crown on the grounds that its charter, granted by Charles II in 1662, forbade it. The royal commissioners thus accepted the Mohegans' argument that they had made an alliance with the colony in the 1630s, had assisted them in their war with the Pequots in 1637, in return for having their ancestral lands secured to them, an agreement the Mohegans argued had been ratified by a treaty in 1683. Got a map here. So this is a map that Johnson took to London as part of the legal brief. So it's actually the sort of the case as the colony was perceiving it. So they're willing to grant the Mohegans a little area called the Mohegan Fields. The larger yellow area is the area they claimed that the Pequots had controlled, and then the smaller sort of bit in the corner, but the bit bigger than the Mohegan Fields, is the area that the tribe had been awarded in 1705, but which they'd never been able to take control of. So we're talking about a non-trivial amount of land. So the colony lost in 1705, but Connecticut refused to abide by the Royal Commission ruling, prompting the Mohegans to appeal again to the Crown in the 1730s. These appeals led to the Privy Council establishing another Royal Commission in the colony in 1743. This time, Connecticut did deign to appear, with their lawyers arguing that the Mohegans were merely a part of the Pequots, and that the colony's conquest of the Pequots was in effect a conquest of the Mohegans, or rather that it had given them control of all of the Pequot land, and the land the Mohegans were claiming was actually Connecticut's. The majority of the commissioners in 1743 actually ruled in favor of Connecticut, but they did not accept this conquest argument. So the Mohegans had lost the second Royal Commission. They appeal again to the Crown in 1764. And they do it in part because they know about the Royal Proclamation, and they're inspired now by the sense that the Crown in the early 1760s was taking native rights seriously in the wake of the disastrous native rebellion known as Pontiac's War. So again, this was why Johnson was in London in the 1760s. He's working with the colony's agent to prepare a legal response to the Mohegans' appeal. They published this response in 1770, so they published the legal brief before they go before the Privy Council. And the colony argued or Connecticut argued, that its conquest of the Pequots had given them ownership of all of the territory of the Pequots, which again, as I said, included the land in dispute. And I'll put up their argument here. Oh, I went backwards. We're going backwards. If I got the thing pointed the wrong way, I'm pointing. All right. Here we go, yes. So I apologize for throwing all this text at you. I will read some of it out. So the colony argues, again, this is before the Privy Council in 1770, the English having conquered the Pequots in a just war, in which Uncas, that's the sachem of the Mohegans, in which Uncas, although he was a Pequot and living at Mohegan, had assisted them, a friendship was cultivated between them and the English, and the said Uncas and his men, who the said Uncas and his men, who after the Pequot War were allowed to be a distinct people, and Uncas is the first sachem of that people. The colony's brief goes on to say, by this conquest, a large addition was made to the dominions of the Crown of Great Britain, and the English became thereby absolute owners of that part of America, now called the colony of Connecticut. So they're making a conquest argument. They're making an argument that they have the former Pequot territories by conquest, and that in fact that they had now created a legal title to that. The colony's governor, Jonathan Trumbull, had urged Johnson to make this argument from conquest before the Privy Council. In a letter to Johnson dated November 7, 1770, he said, "You will remember that I told you before your departure hence that the matter of conquest had never been insisted on as it ought to have been in the present dispute." He was actually wrong about that. They'd been making this argument actually in the earlier iterations of the case. Trumbull claimed that, quote, ancient transactions show that the chief sachem of the Pequots was the sovereign lord and proprietor of all the lands and governor of all the people that then were in the bounds now possessed by the inhabitants of this colony. His power and authority extended even beyond the Hudson River. The many sachems thereon paid him tribute for their lands and yielded obedience to all his commands, both in peace and war. That he was the most sovereign, despotic, and rich of any chief sachem or monarch in the 4 colonies of New England, and enjoyed the largest territory. Conquest gained over him spread the English right over all the lands now actually possessed within the same. And then crucially, the colony went on to argue that this conquest was in turn one of the reasons that the Crown gave them their charter in 1662. The charter did not come, they insisted, from the grace or favor of the Crown. Rather, it was in return for a costly and bloody conquest of the Pequots, which had expanded, they were pains to point out, the king's dominions. Now, the colony's legal brief before the Privy Council was less clear about the casus belli, the grounds which made this conquest just. But there's an interesting memo in William Samuel Johnson's legal papers which offers such a justification. They don't make this case actually before the Privy Council, interestingly. So the memo says, it's up here, in regard to the particular nation of the Pequots, it's evident that in the year 1636, they broke their solemn league and covenant with the English in the murder of Captain Stone and company. So there was a kind of renegade English trader who was murdered on the Connecticut River by the Pequots, who actually thought he was a Dutchman. It was a kind of case of mistaken identity. There was another murder of an Englishman in 1638, a guy called John Oldham. So what they're arguing is the colony is by abetting and encouraging and sheltering the murderers of the English from time to time, and finally conspiring the total destruction of the English, the Pequots had compelled the English to engage in a bloody war, which in the year 1637 ended in the total rout and breaking up of the body of the Pequot nation. Such conquest by the law of nations, as well as from the reason of things, is a total forfeiture of the right of the vanquished to all their possessions. This engagement in an unjust war on the part of the aggressor amounts to forfeiture of life and property, as the lesser is always contained in the greater. Now, what's interesting about this is Connecticut's use of conquest does not really comport with how historians have portrayed English justifications for empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. Rather, the scholarly consensus has been that the English justified their presence in America on the grounds that it was an uninhabited wilderness, a wasteland, that could be occupied by those who labored on and improved it. David Armitage, to take but one example, claims that the Carolina colony in the late 1600s was justified by John Locke himself on these very grounds, on this sort of idea of labor. For Armitage, quote, the agriculturalist argument was the best justification that could be given for dispossession after arguments from conquest and religion had been gradually abandoned. Yet we see Connecticut foregrounding this argument as late as the 1770s. So I think the evidence in the Mohegan case suggests that this scholarly consensus needs to be revised. Connecticut did not claim that the land it took was vacant before the English arrived. On the contrary, it was held by a powerful Sachem and his people. Their conquest of him gave them absolute title to his land. A valuable claim in an age when the crown attempted to collect quit-rents from the colonies, that is, for a kind of rent back from the landholders, on the grounds that the land in America was held from the king. I think it's also interesting that Connecticut's using conquest theory because I think by implication it elevated the status of the colony, right? Because if you think about just war theory, one of the grounds is it has to be declared by a legitimate public entity, a kind of state, right? Connecticut was not a legitimate public entity in 1637, as some of you know, right? It was a kind of nascent group of settlers who'd broken away from Massachusetts. So I think it's actually a powerful kind of reimagining of their history in 1771, looking back to 1637. Now you may ask, what does this conquest argument and the case more broadly have to do with the burgeoning imperial crisis? Well, I think there's an answer to this question in the arguments of the landholders, who were also respondents in the case made before the Privy Council. So the colony is responding to the Mohegans. The landholders make a separate legal brief. So the people who are on the territory that would be threatened or their property would be threatened if the colony lost. The landholders go through the same argument about conquest, they go through the same argument about the Pequots being conquered, they go through the same argument about the Mohegans being made into a people. It's an identical argument to the one the colony makes. But they add a couple of other arguments. They insist to the Privy Council that the stakes of this case are really huge. They say, if the appellants, that is the Mohegans, can recover the possession under commissions issued by the crown, similar to those under which the above proceedings have been had, no titles in any of the plantations are safe. The Indians may reclaim all the lands in America whenever they can find a body to assist and support them, for there are none better secured than the lands in question. So for the landholders, they're making a case that all property rights in America, in effect, are at risk, right? If we lose this case. They underline this point. They say, this is the case of the 800 landholders, and not of them only, but of all the landholders in America, who are all liable upon the principle contended for by the appellants, again, that is by the Mohegans, to be brought to England to defend themselves against pretended Indian titles. This complaint against them, that is against the landholders, is precisely what may be made by some Indian nation, as they are affectedly called, against every royal grantee upon that continent, if it be established as a maxim that Indian titles are not to be tried in the ordinary courts of judicature. Like basically, they're saying that the only way to try property rights is in a court with juries, right? A familiar argument. So again, if the case was lost, all property rights in America would be endangered. This was a concern that was shared by the governor of Connecticut, William Pitkin, by Trumbull, who we just quoted, who succeeded him, as well as by the colony's agent, Richard Jackson, who was someone who was very sort of plugged into British politics. There was also concern in Connecticut that losing the case would endanger the colony's ambitious land grab in the Susquehanna Valley to the west. So they're making a claim that their charter actually gives them land in effect land that in effect was in Pennsylvania, and they're worried that if they lose the case, that attempt to get land in the west will be lost because that also is being claimed on the basis of their charter, right? This kind of expansive western land claim of the kind that Connecticut was making was exactly what the Crown was trying to regulate in the 1760s by the Royal Proclamation and by making treaties with native peoples in the West. The letters back and forth between Johnson and the colony's governors, Pitkin and Trumbull, are full of anxious discussions about what plans the Board of Trade and the Colonial Secretary had for the West. As I just noted, they feared that if they lost the Mohegan case, then their potentially lucrative foray into the Susquehanna Valley would be stopped. Both claims, after all, again, rested on the charter and thus on the conquest of the Pequots. They were, in other words, as concerned about the dire effects of imperial reform in the West as they were about it in the East, right? And they don't seem to see any distinction between it. If you read the letters in real time, they're as concerned about taxes and regulations as they are about potential limits on Western settlement. There's another way, I think, in which, for the colonists, imperial reforms in the East and West were intertwined. For the colonies' case against British taxes rested, I want to argue, on the same claims, or at least on some of the same claims they make in the Mohegan case. That is, that their conquest of the Pequots and their purchase of other native lands had led to the king granting them a charter, which in turn guaranteed their rights as English subjects to consent to all laws and taxes that bound them. So, I'll bring up my next. Am I still doing this the wrong way around? I got it. All right. How many historians does it take to? More than one, I think, is the answer, right? So here's what Connecticut says in its declarations and resolves against the Stamp Act. This colony, or the greatest part thereof, was purchased and obtained for great and valuable consideration, and some other parts gained by conquest, with much difficulty, and at the only endeavors and expenses and charges of our forefathers, and that thereby considerable addition was made to His Majesty's dominions and interests, right? So always stressing that what they're doing is benefiting the mother country. And that in consideration, His Majesty King Charles II did grant unto the governor and company of this colony and their successors that all and every of the subjects of him should have and enjoy all liberties and immunities of free and natural subjects, as if they and every one of them were born within the realm of England, right? So the charter is guaranteeing them the same rights as English people in England. The charter was gained in part by conquest. The colony elaborated on this argument in a pamphlet published also in the same year, this is 1764, which enforced their case against the Stamp Act by once again recounting the circumstances of the colony's settlement. And again, it's just the same argument, purchase in part, conquest for the other part. It goes on to say, as you can see here, they were forced for the defense of their lives in those settlements to enter into a war with the principal tribe of Indians, who rose with all their barbarous, insidious, and crafty force and cruelty to roust these new settlers out of the colony. So again, the two principal official arguments against the Stamp Act, I think, were, if you read them, predicated at least in part on the same kind of conquest claim as they were making at the same time in the Mohegan case. Again, which led to the granting of the charter. So I think the confluence of the colony's arguments in the Mohegan case against native rights and its arguments against British taxation suggests that we need to take the West more seriously when we think of the colonial response to imperial reforms in the 1760s and 1770s, right? Again, I think for these people that are living through this in real time, they're not really dichotomizing or separating the two. Now, does this mean that we should conclude that the imperial reforms in the West triggered the colonists to revolt, as Ned Blackhawk contends in his recent prize-winning book, The Rediscovery of America, a claim surely to be as controversial with the public as the 1619 Project's contention that the colonists revolted to defend slavery? I don't think the evidence can bear such a sweeping claim, although we can maybe talk about this. In late 73, the Mohegans lost their appeal before the Privy Council. So if the Crown was really concerned to limit Western settlement, not sure that the colony would have won its case as it did win in 1773. In 1768, as many of you know, they withdraw the army from the West. The proclamation line was redrawn at the Treaty of Stanwix. The Crown actually approved the colony of Vandalia in the Ohio in 1772, a decision which so outraged Hillsborough, the colonial secretary, that he quit. So it doesn't seem to me that the imperial reforms in the West are as constant and as consistent, are as constant and consistent enough to actually have triggered revolt. But I think it's still a possibility. I think it's still a place where we can maybe do some more research if we take the West as seriously as we take the East. I think what we can say, though, if Connecticut is at all typical, that the West, as I've already said, was on their minds as much as the East, and that the arguments they used, conquest in particular, but also purchase and also prescription, they make an argument from long usage. I think that's actually really important, that the arguments they used were intended to fend off native claims as much as they were directed against the pretensions of the king and parliament to sovereignty in America. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to join others in thanking Will and Janelle for putting together this wonderful conference and bringing us all together. I welcome the opportunity to contribute to this conference exploring the real revolution as described by John Adams as a radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affection of the people. Such a change did take place, but when and how it happened is a matter for debate. I'm going to live dangerously and pick a fight with John Adams, and also the scholars who take his words at face value. In the same period as the above quote, he also specified, "The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775 in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was drawn at Lexington." Historians have long accepted Adams' assessment of events and individuals, even after they've learned that he was an unreliable narrator whose positions were frequently out of step with prevailing sentiment. Some have recently argued that the colonies were effectively independent by 1774. Though this patriotic narrative is compelling, Winner's history doesn't do the story justice. It's only by telling the stories of the losers in history, those dissenters whose agendas did not necessarily prevail, that we can begin to understand that events could well have unfolded differently, that is, the road not taken. We thereby uncover the drama of history in the push and pull of opposing forces, the contingent nature of unfolding events, and the valuable lessons not only about what could have been, but even what should have been. In the usual story, John Dickinson is the biggest loser because he didn't want independence. But without Dickinson's story, there is no Adams story. Independence could not have been achieved without Dickinson, and you'll be amazed not only at all he did, but at all he got right. My claim is this: not only was America generally not aiming for independence until 1776, even as Dickinson opposed the movement, paradoxically, he was more responsible than anyone for the creation of independence. No one did more to teach Americans about their rights, how to defend them, and how to be American. No one wrote more for the founding, held more offices, or was more present at critical junctures offering key ideas. This only sounds like fiction if you don't know his record. And few know his record because he's been excluded from the teleological narrative of American history. Indeed, scholars have been so distracted by the fact that Dickinson didn't want independence and spoke against the Declaration that they have missed or dismissed almost everything else he did and said. Independence was not inevitable, but it was foreseeable. Almost a decade before John Adams looked beyond Massachusetts in 1774 and recognized that there was a colony-wide conflict with Britain, Dickinson foresaw separation from Britain and began working simultaneously against the movement for independence and for America's survival as an independent nation. An astute observer of political behavior with Tocquevillian prescience, Dickinson was a master strategist. He anticipated Americans' actions and Britain's reactions, as well as Americans' strengths and failings, and he implemented tactics and policies to enhance the one and mitigate the other. With his Quaker background and the best legal education in the empire, he offered solutions that no other American could and was seen around the Atlantic world and as far away as Poland as the spokesman for the American cause. Historians generally describe the resistance as arising organically, spontaneously, and leaderlessly throughout the colonies. This is true to a certain extent. In the earliest years, however, there was also a significant amount of confusion and flailing. Indignation about unjust taxation ran high in 1764 and 65, which resulted in widespread actions of various sorts. Outraged elites wrote pamphlets to one another with theories justifying their outrage. Some helpful slogans emerged, no taxation without representation, and some unhelpful ideas, internal versus external taxation. Some authors denied Parliament's rights to legislate, others affirmed it. They mostly spoke in terms of the rights of Englishmen. Assemblies mobilized, committees of correspondence formed, and Sons of Liberties organized. These extra-legal groups were important, but they had their limits. First, the committees were seen as temporary solutions to momentary problems and would disband when the immediate objective was met, an indication that the colonists did not fully understand the extent of the problems with Great Britain. Second, their tools were few and ineffective. They advocated non-importation, which could be effective given enough time, but they couldn't boycott things like paper that they couldn't immediately manufacture themselves. When the colonists proved impatient, the Sons of Liberty, the thuggish arm of the resistance, turned to violence, rioting, and threatening stamp officers. No elite stepped forward to put forth a theory of resistance and lead the people because all they had in their toolbox was the Whig theory of revolution, and no one was there yet in the early 1760s. Ultimately, the committees were a headless creature whose tentacles reached far but lacked the direction provided by a central intelligence. Dickinson became that central intelligence. He first led the 1765 Stamp Act Congress, drafting its two documents, the Petition to the King and the Declaration of Rights, in which he insisted on the language of natural rights. Then, as violence spread down the coast from New England, he noticed a void in the leadership that, if not filled, would cause events to spiral out of control and the British to crush them swiftly. No one was speaking to ordinary Americans or offering concrete suggestions for how they should act. He therefore explained to them in a short and simple broadside why the Stamp Act precedent was dangerous and what they should do about it. He offered a strategy pioneered by the pacifist Quakers in their struggle for religious liberty, civil disobedience. That is, the public, nonviolent breaking of unjust laws with the intent of raising the awareness of the public and injustice and creating change from the ground up. By these means, the colonists would repeal the offending law virtually, which would ultimately be repealed by Parliament actually. The broadside was well received, and Dickinson's advice was adopted by the Sons of Liberty, among other groups. Civil disobedience was only the first Quaker tactic Dickinson brought to the conflict. The next was mediation, a service Quakers had been offering their non-Quaker neighbors for decades. Continuing the work he had begun as a Pennsylvania legislator, he built coalitions, united hostile factions, and explained to one party the position of the other, frequently by adopting pseudonymous personas to appear neutral or empathetic. After his broadside to ordinary Americans, he wrote a pamphlet to the British elite to explain why the new taxation policy was damaging both to the colonists and to Great Britain. Shortly thereafter, he wrote to the Conservative Committee of Correspondence in Barbados to explain why the resistance techniques he advocated were not rebellious. Most tellingly, in a 1765 letter to William Pitt, he detailed the potentially devastating consequences if Britain persisted in the new policy, namely that the colonies would seek independence. Moreover, he warned, they would succeed. What he feared was their eventual disintegration into, quote, a mutual of commonwealths, crimes, and calamities, centuries of mutual jealousies, hatreds, wars, and devastations, till at last the exhausted provinces shall sink into slavery under the yoke of some fortunate conqueror. He did not predict, however, if our conqueror would be Russia or China. To investigate the revolutionary change among the American people before independence, Adams tells us that, quote, the newspapers in all the colonies ought to be consulted during that period to ascertain the steps by which the public opinion was enlightened and informed concerning the authority of Parliament over the colonies. Well, I'm glad he suggested it, because that's precisely how we know Dickinson dominated the pre-independence narrative. From the end of 1767 on, the newspapers were full of items by, to, and about Dickinson. The evidence is as clear as can be, yet historians have overlooked it because before the newspapers were digitized, it was easy to miss if you weren't actively searching for it, and almost no one was because of their Dickinson-shaped blind spot. When the Townshend Acts were passed in 1767, most Americans were complacent. The committees of correspondence had disbanded and the Sons of Liberty were dormant. Dickinson saw clearly that these new taxes were intended to test the efficacy of the 1766 Declaratory Act. Towards the end of the year, when there were still no protests, he felt compelled to act and published his most famous work, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Like his 1765 broadside, Dickinson's aim was to empower the people, to educate them about their rights, and how to defend them peacefully in order to prevent oppression, violence, and separation from Britain. Significantly, the farmers' letters encouraged Americans in the single most important thing that would allow them to reform British policy and, should that goal fail, enable them to survive as an independent nation: unity. That unity would be based on their distinct American identity. And this was the radical change that John Adams meant, but it was far from solidified in 1768 or 1776. The responses to the farmer began after the first letter appeared in December 1767. The Massachusetts Assembly, led by Samuel Adams, hastened to follow the farmer's advice by issuing the famed circular letter that organized the colonies into a concerted resistance effort. The town of Boston then thanked the farmer for the inspiration. From then on, a deluge of tributes in the form of letters, gratitude, dedicated poems, pamphlets, physical depictions, advertisements for goods and services invoking the farmer, and more poured in from around the colonies. These 12 letters launched Dickinson to international celebrity, and yes, he was even more famous than Benjamin Franklin, as the person who taught them how to recognize and defend their rights. His star status and his message was solidified in the summer of 1768 when he published the Liberty Song, America's first patriotic song, containing a line that became America's national motto as it was repeated in the newspapers and public assemblies: "By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall." At this point, with most colonies united behind the non-importation agreement, he targeted the reluctant Quakers in Pennsylvania and got them on board as well. From 1768 to spring 1776, no one had more power or influence in America than the Pennsylvania farmer. Time and again, local leaders in other colonies looked to him for guidance. After the Boston Massacre in 1770, when attorneys John Adams and Josiah Quincy defended the British soldiers, they closed by quoting the farmer, chiding their fellow Bostonians for ignoring his directives. In 1771, when Son of Liberty Alexander McDougall in New York was accused of libel by the Provincial Assembly for criticizing their approval of funds for quartering British troops, he requested Dickinson's services as defense attorney. After the Rhode Islanders boarded and burned the British schooner Gaspee in 1772, fearing reprisals from the British, the panicked Assembly wrote to Dickinson begging his advice. Richard Henry Lee in Virginia also sought Dickinson's opinion on the matter. After Samuel Adams led the 1773 Boston Tea Party, he sheepishly wrote to Dickinson, hoping that the coercive acts were not punishment for how they had imprudently acted. In 1774, Arthur Lee implored Dickinson to take up his pen to advise Americans on how to behave as the coercive acts went into effect. Calls for a colony-wide Congress began in spring 1774. With Pennsylvania as the geographical, economic, and cultural center of British North America, logically, the Congress should meet there. Other leaders only awaited Dickinson's approval. But Pennsylvania was becoming increasingly polarized. On the one hand, the Quakers were retreating into neutrality and taking the Provincial Assembly with them, and on the other, the radicals, consisting largely of Scotch-Irish Presbyterian working men, enemies of the Quaker elite, were increasingly considering violence to demonstrate solidarity with Boston. Dickinson was the only leader whom all factions trusted. With the help of allies such as Charles Thompson, he unified them in favor of peaceful protest, established a shadow government to bypass the Assembly, and secured support for hosting the First Continental Congress. The farmer was the main attraction for the delegates from the other colonies. Lesser-known figures, Patrick Henry, George Washington, Josiah Quincy, John Adams, sought introductions and tried to learn all the details of his life. None was more starstruck than Adams, who gushed about Dickinson in his diary. When Congress convened, Dickinson's agenda for reconciliation and resistance dominated despite his not being seated as a delegate until the last few days. While Samuel Adams considered Dickinson a true Bostonian, Cousin John became disgruntled when Dickinson's drafts of key documents supplanted his own. Thus began Adams' decades-long campaign to discredit Dickinson and his achievements, or take credit for them himself. Dickinson's prowess as a strategist and charismatic leader is most evident in 1775 and 76, when his tactics shifted from preventing independence to delaying it, and when pushback from radicals with Adams in the lead began and intensified. At the opening of the Second Congress in May 1775, shortly after Lexington and Concord, they questioned their purpose: reconciliation or independence. John Adams himself proclaimed America's loyalty to the crown. Dickinson, still the undisputed leader of that body, offered 3 ways they could proceed. First, seek reconciliation. Second, prepare for war. And third, do both and send agents to negotiate with Britain. He advised the third option, and that's what he got. Congress voted unanimously for a second petition to the king and a declaration on taking up arms, and they passed the resolution to send agents. After John Jay and Thomas Jefferson took stabs at the petition and the declaration respectively, Dickinson stepped in to rewrite both into their final forms. The former had been too strong, and the latter had been too weak. Though people are generally confused when they learn that Dickinson wrote both documents, especially since Jefferson took credit for the declaration, it was, as one of my students described it, a chess move. The so-called Olive Branch Petition served multiple purposes: as a last attempt for reconciliation, to gauge the temper of the ministry, to buy time to prepare for war, and as legal cover for war and independence, proof to the world that they had done all they could to prevent these things. Dickinson's main purpose with the declaration was the same as that of the petition: to prevent war, this time by creating such apprehensions in the British that they wouldn't dare attack. And should that fail, the other purpose was to rouse a martial and patriotic spirit in the newly formed Continental Army. One final step Dickinson took, and this has newly come to light in a recently discovered source, is that he drafted a bill he hoped that Parliament would pass called an Act for Relieving the Inhabitants of the Colonies from Certain Fears and Jealousies. This is a remarkable attempt by Americans to shape the legislative agenda in Parliament via a back door. This is a classic Dickinson move. He did the same thing with the legislatures of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and the United States. A great example of the teleology perpetuated by the Adams cult comes from historian Joseph Ellis. He claims that after the Olive Branch Petition was rejected, quote, Dickinson was understandably silent, since the diplomatic path forward he had hoped to blaze had become a dead end. By the late fall of 1775, Dickinson had become the chief spokesman for those reluctant American patriots who did not know what to do. But in reality, Dickinson was laser-focused on preparing for war and delaying independence. First, he wrote military policy, worked for the Committee of Safety to root out and punish traitors, and as the commander of the 1st Philadelphia Battalion of Associators, he possessed de facto control over the entire Pennsylvania militia. Considering that this was one of the largest military forces in the colonies, combined with Dickinson's political influence in Congress and over public opinion, no man in America was more powerful than he was at that moment. The very sight of him cutting a dashing figure in his military uniform prompted young men to enlist. But when John Adams complained more than once that the British viewed Dickinson as the ruler of America, it wasn't mere hyperbole. Second, as Adams encouraged congressional delegates to reform their respective colonial legislatures into Republican ones in anticipation of independence, Dickinson countered in November 1775 with a document that's really one of the most important of this era. It was instructions to the Pennsylvania delegates to Congress forbidding them to vote on independence. With this, Dickinson single-handedly halted the revolutionary movement brewing in Congress. Without Pennsylvania, nothing could happen. Yet this was not any arbitrary expression of Dickinson's will. This was the will of his constituents. Only a few days before he wrote these instructions, Quakers and radicals in Pennsylvania battled with petitions over support for the militia. The Quakers refused, and the radicals objected to this. But on one key issue, they were in agreement. Even as the radicals demanded military resistance to Britain, they professed their fealty to the British monarchy. Thus, no significant group in Pennsylvania wanted revolution or independence. Dickinson was not done with any of his actions. He stopped the New Jersey Assembly from making concessions to the British. He continued to plan for sending agents to negotiate. He volunteered to lead his battalion to New York to fight the British, and he facilitated an alliance with the Lenape people. When events conspired in the spring of 1776 to convince Dickinson that a declaration could no longer be resisted, in June he rewrote instructions to the Pennsylvania delegates permitting them to vote their consciences. And he continued preparing for independence. He drafted the first 13 provisions that became the Plan of Treaties, the basis for American foreign policy until World War II, which Adams then copied and took exclusive credit for. And he drafted the Articles of Confederation with two notable provisions, one for a strong central government to which the states would be subordinate, and a religious liberty clause for dissenters that protected women's freedom of worship and public speech. This is, I submit, the most radical moment of the revolution. Let's not forget as well that John Adams laughed at Abigail when she asked him to remember the ladies. These provisions were intended to replace the British Constitution Americans were about to cast aside and prevent the calamities Dickinson saw so clearly as a consequence of independence. In his speech against independence on July 1st, he reiterated all the ways America was unprepared. Like his draft of the Articles of Confederation, his colleagues rejected all of these concerns. Dickinson then stepped aside to assure the vote on the Declaration was unanimous, and then he led his battalion to the front to fight the British. John Adams praised the delay of the Declaration, claiming it had cemented the American Union, but he was wrong. More than a few of Dickinson's fears came to pass, many of which he managed as a member of Congress or as president of Pennsylvania. Indian raids, a civil war between Pennsylvania and Connecticut, a threatened mutiny of Continental soldiers, rampant financial crime, a diplomatic crisis, not to mention Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. Most alarmingly and foreseeable was the persecution of the Quakers. At the instigation of Thomas Paine and John Adams, the leading Quakers in Philadelphia, including many of Dickinson's relatives, were rounded up, denied habeas corpus, and exiled to Virginia. Dickinson predicted one other thing in his final speech. With one or two failed campaigns, he argued, the British would tire of fighting and give Americans everything they asked for in their first petition. That, too, came to pass in 1778 with the Carlisle Commission. By then, even Dickinson had given up on reconciliation. Now he demanded British recognition of American independence, and he devoted the rest of his life to securing it. Reintroducing Dickinson into the narrative compels us to reconsider the road to independence. If it wasn't his road, he left us many signposts. Steadfast resistance to oppression and advocacy of rights through nonviolence, power in the people, unity and constitutional perpetuity through a strong central government, protections for individual rights. We eventually remembered these signposts. It took us a few years, sometimes a couple of centuries, to get where Dickinson wanted us to go. So Dickinson, in the end, may be the biggest winner of them all. But this is not, right now, the end of history. Our question now is, will we stay on his road? Thank you.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists for three really thought-provoking papers. I'll offer just a few brief words into a segue into a question for them, and you guys can take the question on board, or you can poke at its premises if you want, and then we'll open it up to the floor. You know, it strikes me that all of these papers are fundamentally interested in the question of power. Who gets to exercise it, over whom, over who else, under what conditions, and all of these papers are engaged with historical actors at moments of deep uncertainty, experimenting with different ideas in tumultuous periods about how power can be shared or taken or ceded. We heard from Professor Gould, Ben Franklin experimenting with different ideas of empire, including notably a federated mode. We heard from Professor Yirush about this Mohegan bid to appeal to external authority, to royal authority, to these royal commissioners, and a bid to salvage their own rights against a colonial power. And then we heard from Dr. Calvert about the role of John Dickinson in seeking to secure the rights of colonists against royal power, against British authority. And maybe people will forgive me as a constitutional historian for bringing this forward into the 1780s. But when we look at the differences between the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution, there are many differences we can find. I think among the most salient, one would be the centralization of power in the Constitution relative to the mode we have under the Articles. And another would be the creation of entirely new branches that are exercising powers unknown under the Articles, like a federal judiciary, like a federal executive. Under the Articles, we only have a Congress. And, my dissertation advisor once told me years ago that, if you ever need to make an argument about any development in history, you could just give some version of, well, actually, it's more complicated than that, and it started even earlier. and so the question I'm curious about is, if we take the common argument that I've often heard that we can see the U.S. Constitution as a reaction to the American experiment under the Articles of Confederation, it strikes me in hearing these three papers that actually maybe those transitions that we see from the Articles to the Constitution, actually it's more complicated than that, and it started even earlier. And so I want to put that question to each of you. What can we learn from your topics about this transition to a new form of government from our first kind of constitution to our second, the only two we've ever had in a relatively short period of time. Or if you want to take issue with that premise, I would invite you to do that as well. So maybe we could start with Professor Yirush and work our way down the table.
I think one thing that strikes me is that what happens in 76 is it becomes impossible to do what the Mohegans did anymore, because there's no power to appeal to, right, beyond or above federal or state authorities, right? And I think it's striking if you think about what was Madison's original vision for the Constitution. He wanted a kind of federal veto over state laws. I think he wanted to recreate the Privy Council to some extent, or to have some body that would protect minority rights. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest transitions is you can't appeal to the king, minorities can't appeal against local majorities to some other source of justice, right? And I think that's why Madison had that provision in there, which of course didn't go down well at the convention.
Oh, let's see. Sorry. Okay.
Oh, was my mic on?
Yeah, there are a number of ways I could approach this. I guess I'll say first that in wrestling with this issue, I think Dickinson was sort of groping towards a federal solution as early as the farmers' letters. And then he came, and then he sort of tried to put that into effect with his draft of the Articles of Confederation, and it didn't fly. And then when he was president of Delaware and then president of Pennsylvania, he started using imagery that he then repeated in the federal convention, describe the solar system metaphor, where he described the federal sun with the states as planets revolving around it, and that kind of caught on, and it was sort of a teaching tool that he used with his colleagues. So yeah, I think these were germinating, and I think he got the idea probably from the structure of Quaker meetings, which had a similar like a yearly meeting with then smaller meetings kind of revolving around it. But it's interesting to see he did have an evolution of where the power should actually be, and I don't think he started out. I don't know. I think he kind of went back and forth about, I was just asking myself, when did he see the power as being in the people? And I think early on in his career, he was more sort of friendly to sort of democratic ideas, and he kind of bragged about the Pennsylvania Assembly. Oh, look how great it is! It doesn't have any, stupid upper house and fancied imitation of the House of Lords, and we don't need that silliness. But then when things kind of started getting chaotic and revolutionary and violent, and he kind of backed away from popular sovereignty, and in his notes for before the First Continental Congress, he kind of writes to himself. He's like, yeah, well, the people aren't really proper for sovereigns because they they don't have what it takes in the sense of being able to understand, the complicated, complicated ideas, and they can't really know all the secrets of and follow diplomacy and stuff like that. And so he was backing away, and then I think this was kind of maybe reinforced in the chaos of the revolution. But then by the Federal Convention, he comes back around to being a small d Democrat and really understanding that the power had to be in just the people, and then he spent the rest of his career kind of trying to promote civic education, and even the lowest sorts of people, the poorest children, should be taught to read classical languages so they could read the Greeks and the Romans in the original. So yeah, I think it's an evolution, and sometimes it's not linear either, and lots of interesting ideas.
This is on. You could say a lot of the same thing about Franklin. He's famously or notoriously flexible and goes back and forth. And I actually think that's one of the ways he makes his attachment to these two forms of empire work, because he doesn't insist on a consistency. But I do think that he ultimately is in favor of a more centralized union. And this comes through most clearly. We referenced at the end of the last session the question of imperial centralization and slavery. Franklin's practically his last public statement before he dies in 1790 is as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which submits a petition to Congress calling on Congress to use the General Welfare Clause to enact legislation to abolish slavery, not just the slave trade. It's a very radical proposal. The South Carolina delegation's heads explode. It triggers the first of the great three crises over slavery, and leading to the Compromise of 1790. And Franklin ends up writing a satire. It's his last public statement, satirizing the South Carolina congressmen who are denouncing it. So, and there we see him coming down very strongly on the side of a strong concerted use of federal power. So at least in that moment, had he lived longer, there might have been other moments where he would have backed off. But I think he actually probably has a lot in common with Dickinson, including that Adams doesn't like him either.
Thank you. We want to invite people from the audience to come forward and ask questions. So don't be shy.
So this might be a bit out of the scope, but particularly regarding federation. You mentioned that there's this early idea of federation with the English in the 1500s, and as you were saying that, I was thinking about later attempts at imperial federation, particularly in the 1890s, early 1900s. Is there something about British political culture in particular that's interested in this imperial federation, or is it Parliament? Is it the structure, or is it just something that empires think about, struggle with?
Boy, that's a great question. So I'm thinking back to the great Sir Lewis Namier. His explanation for why Britain couldn't accept federation in 1776 is that the crown had not yet become the merely symbolic kind of figurehead that it would be by the late 19th century, which is essential. It still holds parts of the British Commonwealth together. King Charles is the sovereign of Canada and Australia, and I'm not sure who all's still on the list. Some are trying to get off. But it's so that in a funny sort of way, that royal anchor makes possible of a federation of a sort that actually ends up being a lot more difficult within the United States. You could actually say that the way the British Empire evolves makes the kind of federation that someone like Franklin's talking about in 1775 more possible than it is within the United States today. Because again, that merging of kind of the Henrician unitary empire with federalism is a very uneasy balance. And the various iterations of our Constitution that we've had, including after Reconstruction, is all about constantly rebalancing that relationship. And you're right, it's a very different story within the British Empire. Good question.
Other questions?
This is for Professor Calvert. I've always admired the forceful defense of John Dickinson that you offer. I've heard you speak before, and I've read your book. The problem is that it wasn't just Adams who thought this about Dickinson. I mean, you're totally right that Adams, especially in his memoirs, he's just so angry that he's angry at everybody. So he's totally unreliable. But he's not the only one that thought that Dickinson was dithering over independence. Jefferson says he had more ingenuity than conviction or something like that. Or I think it was Charles Lee said similar thing. Dickinson left many people at the Second Continental Congress with the impression that he would never get off the pot. And how is that possible if your account of Dickinson is correct, that Dickinson had this very, this wisely devised carrot and stick approach and everything? How is it that nobody else at the Continental Congress, except James Wilson maybe, came away with that impression?
Well, okay, so, I mean, certainly there were people who Dickinson angered, close friends, other colleagues, and there were people who were frankly kind of angry with him and resented his sway over things and thought it went on too long. I don't know that that's necessarily incompatible with with my argument. Just that, and I think one thing to keep in mind too is like these people, they kind of, the people who were starting to head towards independence, they kept it from him. They were sort of talking about this stuff kind of behind his back, and he only kind of knew about it as it sort of burst forth at the moment of independence. And he was mad about it because he was like, here I find now that this has all been you all have been talking about this, and I can't say why they didn't necessarily bring it to him, but I think too, he was sort of people who knew him would be frustrated by his principled stances on things, not just independence. He could be very stubborn about stuff, and maybe that's his kind of his Achilles heel. If he felt something would violate his conscience, there was just no way you could talk him into doing it. I mean, he even like his fiance, he refused to get married under a Quaker ceremony because she wanted a Quaker ceremony, and he's like, he wouldn't do it, and so he was like ready to let her go, and she finally came around. Otherwise, I don't think he would have married her. So there is a stubbornness there, but there was still also an abiding respect for what he was doing. Which is, I think, why people were kind of surreptitiously trying to get around him, and they needed his support on various matters. But yeah, I mean, he certainly angered people, and some of them felt betrayed. And but it's a combination of yes, strategy, but also stubbornness and conscience. And he was a pretty complicated guy.
Thank you for this panel. I wanted to pose a question comment, putting together all three sessions that we've had today, particularly related to the portrait of patriotic Americans reluctant about the final step of independence, Franklin and Dickinson, of a culture of liberty shared in the mother country in the colonies, and the tragedy of this, in a way, that London, to its credit, was very bad at being imperial in managing an empire because it doesn't fit. So they're not the Romans. Gibbon might want to celebrate the Romans, but this is not really the spirit of law and liberty and common law and liberty in London. And then on the American side, that they're willing to be patient and be reluctant. And finally, they've just had it, But the tragedy of those two coming together. And some in the audience will be shocked to hear me mention Montesquieu, but the comment that Montesquieu makes in The Spirit of Law in 1748 about the England, it is a republic under the cloak of a monarchy. Right. But the tension between those two and tension of empire. He also says they send the English people out into the New World with their spirit of law and liberty and commerce, and great peoples are being raised in the forest. But all of that somehow tragic, or potentially tragic.
I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is that what's happening within this British world is not the only thing, and I continue to be struck by just how terrified people are by what's happening in Poland. And if you look at a map, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth is about the same size as Eastern North America. I mean, it's a vast country, and it's a republic, and it's got a constitution, and it shows that if you don't get this right, a lot of bad things can happen. And a lot of people are talking about this. So, it's I think the dangerous world they're in, which I think Peter and Annette are going to be talking about after break, is also part of that.
Okay, with that, we have come to the end of our time, so we'll note that we have a 15-minute break to be followed by our keynote conversation, Thomas Jefferson in a World at War, moderated by Professor Hay and featuring Professors Gordon Reed and Onif. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, good job.
That part, as it's because the paper.